the author of Offshore Capital Without Borders, who has been writing about these very issues, including this big piece in The Atlantic in November and the Broligarchy issues that I mentioned. Professor Harrington, explain.
Well, thank you for having me here. I think what the American people need to understand that hasn't been covered well by mass media is that our government is in the process of experiencing a hostile takeover. And it's not just by business elites in general, but by a faction of business elites who have a very specific political program that is, as you said, years in the making. It didn't come out of Musk's head. It didn't come out of nowhere, but it has been developed over decades. And it calls itself the new monarchy, the new monarchism. And neo-reactionism, neo-reactionary belief systems militate against democracy. What they want is to replace democracy as we've known it with corporate monarchy, in which CEOs are rulers. And that's really what we saw at the inauguration, that front row in which you pointed out those corporate CEOs were placed in front of cabinet members. That is to signify this new nobility that's going to rule over us. And let me ask you to,
I'm jumping in to ask you to build on that, because when people hear that, sometimes they think, well, monarch, autocrat, it sounds extreme to the American ear. And yet, can you educate us about what your work has found about how many of these people routinely operate and thrive in other parts of the world with autocratic governments? So what might sound even like rhetoric to a casual news listener, perhaps, in their case is, of course, they know how to work with China, and they sometimes might find it better for their companies.
Yeah, you're right. This process of learning to disregard the formal mechanisms of government is something that many of these CEOs have trained on doing outside the U.S., and now they're kind of bringing it back home. Long ago, there was a Martinican poet and political theorist named Aimé Césaire, and he coined this idea of an imperial boomerang. He basically says whatever an empire does overseas to the colonized people eventually swings back and lands on imperial shores. And basically, for years, we've had this kind of corporate imperialism advancing American power overseas. And many of the techniques and tactics and political beliefs they've honed from that process are boomeranging back to American shores right now.
Right. Yeah. 400 years, and it's the same philosophy, as some say. Jason, your thoughts on all the above?
You know, I love this concept, and I think it's very important for Americans to understand. You can say all oligarchs are bad, which I think there's a reasonable argument to be made, but these are not people. The Elon Musk, the Zuckerbergs, the Peter Thiels, they're not motivated by a long-term future and benevolence. They're not trying to create universities and foundations where their name will carry on. In many respects, they're nihilists. They think that humanity is over. They think the only way that we can transcend is through their brilliance. These guys present themselves like Tony Stark, right? But they're really more like Rick Sanchez and Rick and Morty. They're sad, addicted people who may be brilliant in their own right, but you don't want them running anything. And so we see that with the way that Elon Musk handled Twitter. We see that with Mark Zuckerberg saying, yeah, I learned how to be a real man because I started doing mixed martial arts. Dude, you're 40-something years old. You're just figuring out how to be a man. All of these things would be fine if these guys were just in therapy or they were only podcasters. But once they start having an influence on policy, that kind of use of policy to fulfill whatever gaps are going on with inside of you is not a smart way to run a country. And that's what people need to be aware of when they're voting for anybody who wants to stand next to these men.
Professor Jason, being the fellow erudite, nerdy scholar that he is, brings up Rick and Morty. Rick Sanchez in that great sci-fi cartoon, addressing sort of the mob, says, I welcome your boos because I've seen what you cheer for. And you look at some of what has gone viral in the political space, whether it's some of the sort of toxic one-sided stuff Jason mentioned, or these greater and greater appeals to philosophies that say maybe democracy doesn't matter, or it doesn't matter if your side's not winning. How do you look at that effect specifically in the American body politic, Professor Harrington, when these tools and platforms are pushing quite clearly some of those things to be more mainlined or popular?
Well, what Musk is really doing here is mainlining this neo-reactionary philosophy that says not only that democracy doesn't matter, but that it's dead, and that we're just deciding what to do with the body.
Right.
And that what should be done is that high T alpha males, that's just a pseudoscientific gloss on the divine right of kings, by the way. That's no different from saying, mon Dieu et mon droit, as the British nobility used to say. They believe that democracy is dead, and that they are not only the best and the brightest, but they're born that way to rule over the rest of us. And what Musk has been doing with Doge is enacting quite systematically the manifesto written by the philosopher king of this neo-reactionary movement. His name is Curtis Yarvin, and he was profiled in the New York Times Magazine a couple of weeks ago. You can read about him there. But one of his ideas is what he called RAGE, retire all government employees, which means mass indiscriminate layoffs, just as you described. And, they have all kinds of other treats in store for us, like perhaps undermining the value of the US dollar and replacing it with cryptocurrency. And all this instability is part of the move fast and break things ethos, which it works maybe if you're a startup, but it definitely does not work if you're trying to run the biggest economy in the world with the largest nuclear arsenal.